A fissure opens beneath the Black Pyramid, revealing corridors where shadows move wrong, and walls have absorbed the bones of the dead. Every breath tastes metallic, every step echoes hours behind, and the stone seems to anticipate your every motion. You realize too late, this is not just a tomb. It teaches, it remembers, and it follows. By the time you emerge, the desert itself obeys its lessons, and your body will never be yours again. The sun rose blood red over the endless dunes, casting a molten glare that turned the sand into liquid fire. The winds carried a faint susurration, voices that had not spoken in millennia, brushing across the ears of the excavation team with the weight of forgotten warnings. At the base of the Black Pyramid, a fissure yawned suddenly, jagged and impossible, a wound in the stone that led downward into darkness deeper than any map had dared to show. Torches were lowered along the rope, their flames trembling, casting quivering shadows that stretched and recoiled across walls like living things. The air grew heavy as if the earth itself had exhaled after centuries of silence, carrying the acrid tang of iron and dust, the subtle, metallic scent of bones long absorbed into stone. Each breath tasted of age and pressure, the subtle texture of stone against lungs, as though inhaling was a negotiation with the pyramid itself. Every footstep on the limestone planks reverberated through the shaft with delay, echoing faintly, returning altered, distorted, reminding the explorers that time within this place had its own rules. The rope vibrated with subtle resistance, pulling against hands as if unseen fingers measured weight, posture, and hesitation, testing the living before they even reached the chamber below. The walls were impossibly smooth, carved with a precision that mocked mortal hands, yet etched with faint irregularities that hinted at something deliberate, something attentive. A shard of sandstone fell from above, striking the planks with a muted thud that lingered in the air, vibrating against bone, a warning pressed into the ears and the nervous systems of all who descended. As the last person cleared the upper lip of the shaft, the fissure seemed to exhale, a thin wind that carried grains of sand upward like smoke, curling around torch flames and making them dance with unnatural shadows. Light and dark were no longer opposites here. They were intervals of perception, modulated by a presence that required observation to exist. The farther they descended, the more the stone felt alive, aware of every tremor, every hesitation. Fingers brushed against the walls and felt them resist subtle shifts in the grain, the temperature, the weight, as if the pyramid measured compliance with its own secret logic. Sand shifted beneath boots in ways that made the descent treacherous, revealing shallow depressions and ridges that were too deliberate to be natural, too careful to be mistakes. The torches cast irregular pools of yellow-orange against the limestone, revealing surfaces etched with faint, almost imperceptible lines, scratches that might have been tools or might have been the imprint of human lives pressed too long against stone. A whisper of cold rose from the depths, carrying the faintest sound of water dripping where no moisture should exist, the hollow resonance of something stored, something patient, something that had waited for this exact moment. The team pressed forward, one careful step after another, the sense of gravity altered by the descending shaft, the walls narrowing just enough to make the air itself feel like a barrier, thickening around lungs and thought alike. With each meter, the light revealed more of the impossible geometry, angles that should not meet, planes that rejected expectation, surfaces that seemed to correct the posture of the body as it moved. The shadows of the explorers lengthened and bent upon themselves, flickering with delayed echoes, moving not in concert with the living, but with some memory pressed into the stone. The last rope rung shivered in the grip of hands, and then went slack, leaving the team poised on the edge of the first chamber. The torchlight fell onto the floor below and revealed shapes that made the heart tighten, faint outlines of human forms embedded in the limestone, impressions of shoulders, knees, and skulls, preserved in the stone as if pressed there for eternity. The Black Pyramid had already begun to teach, and the lessons were not gentle. Every inhalation carried the weight of centuries. Every exhalation pressed back against lungs. Every shadow hinted at movement and attention that was not theirs. Silence, when it came, was not absence. It was the attention of stone, waiting, patient, and impossibly old. The chamber yawned before them, vast and suffocating, its ceiling lost in shadows that twisted with the flickering torchlight. The walls were lined with human forms, frozen in grotesque obedience, skeletons pressed into the limestone as though the stone itself had reached out and claimed them. Fingers stretched at impossible angles, ribs flattened against the rock, shoulders rotated into postures no living body could maintain, and heads tilted in eternal listening. The air smelled of old dust, resin, and something sharper beneath it, the lingering tang of iron and decay. Yet no corpse decayed here in the way they had known. It was as though time itself had been halted and compressed, filtered through the stone until it became something else entirely. Every footstep echoed hours behind the body that had once occupied this space, and every inhalation returned metallic and hollow, a slow, measured whisper of life that had long since ceased to exist. The torch flames trembled in the presence of the shapes, and the shadows they cast bent unnaturally, stretching along the walls in ways that resisted understanding, slipping between the angles of limestone like living tendrils. Above, beams of stone, carved with impossible precision, loomed like the limbs of a giant, ready to crush with a weight that could not be measured, yet they held with patience so absolute that it mocked the instinct for caution, teaching that fear was a luxury wasted on eternity. The team moved slowly, every step calculated, boots scraping against the worn limestone that was smooth and yet unyielding, polished by centuries of contact that could not have been human alone. The floor tilted subtly in places, shifting beneath their weight, a gentle manipulation that forced knees to bend in ways that mirrored the positions embedded into the walls, pressing the living into rhythms dictated by the dead. A fine dust rose with each motion, clinging to skin, eyelashes, and tongues, a powder that tasted faintly metallic and sweet, as though it contained the memory of every breath ever drawn within this chamber. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, imperceptibly at first, subtle expansions and contractions that caught the corner of vision, rising and falling in slow, measured pulses that synchronized with the nervous system, not with the clocks or the passage of hours. As they advanced, the skeletal figures became more numerous, layered in relief along the walls, some partially embedded, others fully consumed by stone, fused until the line between human and mineral blurred into a single, grotesque continuity. In certain places, joints had merged with rock so completely that the separation seemed theoretically impossible, the stone having accepted the form of flesh and kept it, a permanent imprint that resisted decay and memory alike. Torchlight caught the glimmer of what appeared to be gold thread intertwined with bones, ritual remnants that had long since lost their context but had not lost their function. They guided attention, traced patterns across the walls that forced the eye to follow, shaping perception as much as the architecture itself. The air thickened in the center of the chamber, compressing lungs, slowing movement, forcing careful inhalations and deliberate exhalations, the body learning quickly that the environment demanded compliance before understanding. Each inhalation brought with it an echo of those who had come before, a faint vibration in the chest that resonated with memories pressed into the stone, the living briefly inhabiting the impressions of the dead. Their shadows were no longer their own, elongated and distorted by angles that bent light in impossible directions, cast upon walls that bore the weight of centuries of ritual, suffering, and meticulous attention. The team became aware that the chamber itself was watching, measuring, absorbing every hesitation, every adjustment in balance or stance, a presence encoded into the limestone, as if the material itself had evolved a consciousness through observation and pressure. Small collapses of sand and dust occurred in precise intervals, not random, falling in ways that drew attention to particular skeletal formations or patterns in the walls, guiding movement, instructing posture without a single word. Every scrape of boot against stone was answered by a subtle shift in resistance, the floor tilting just enough to redistribute weight, the walls pressing lightly against shoulders and backs, coaxing compliance from the living in the same way they had molded the dead. The deeper into the chamber the team moved, the more the walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm independent of their own, a heartbeat not theirs but recorded, stored, and now replaying as a subtle correction of movement and thought. Air pockets trapped in the stone whispered as torches passed, releasing small puffs that carried the scent of mineral, blood, and incense, a combination impossible to categorize yet instinctively alarming, an olfactory signature of obedience and control. In places, the skeletons leaned over one another in stacked relief, creating a lattice that appeared structurally necessary, as though the dead themselves were propping up the chamber, holding ceilings in position with unnatural architecture, teaching the living by example what permanence required. Fingers scraped against bone fused to limestone, and a faint vibration traveled through the arms into the spine, the subtle pressure of presence that spoke of measured intention, of design perfected over centuries. Each step brought new discoveries, rib cages flattened against walls as if pressed during sleep, skulls tilted in listening postures that suggested awareness even in death, phalanges curved around edges of stone as if testing for strength and responsiveness, the geometry of human anatomy absorbed into the architecture in grotesque, deliberate detail. The torchlight revealed faint lines etched into the walls that might have been hieroglyphs or might have been scratches from hands seeking purchase, evidence that the chamber itself had recorded the presence of those who entered and molded it in return. Every attempt to move quickly was corrected subtly, floors sloping, walls narrowing, air thickening, an invisible hand teaching the body to align with the hidden logic pressed into stone over generations. The team could feel themselves learning without knowing, bodies adapting instinctively, muscles conforming to the rhythm of the room, lungs accepting the compression of air, balance shifting to accommodate angles unseen. The chamber did not demand fear. It demanded recognition, attention, compliance, and the team understood, without a word or gesture, that survival here was measured not by speed or strength, but by patience and observation. The further they progressed, the more the skeletal forms multiplied, embedded in layers of relief so intricate that the walls themselves became a map of posture, pressure, and presence. Each contour of the stone was purposeful, each shadow a lesson, each delayed echo a correction. As the team paused at the chamber's center, the weight of history pressed down, thick and tangible, the air vibrating with centuries of measured observation. Every inhalation, every heartbeat, every tremor of muscle was catalogued, integrated into the chamber's memory. The Black Pyramid was no longer merely a tomb. It was a teacher, an observer, a silent, unyielding architect of form and function, and the living had already begun to obey its lessons before they fully understood them. The walls exhaled faintly, carrying the scent of dust and mineral and iron, the metallic tang of obedience, and for the first time, the explorers realized the scope of what they had entered, a place where death had been perfected, compressed, and fused into stone, and where life was already adapting to the same relentless logic. The labyrinth stretched outward in impossible dimensions, corridors twisting and folding in ways that defied reason, stairways curling into ceilings, walls bending to angles that refused comprehension. Each passage seemed to anticipate the explorer's movements, the stone recording weight and posture with a precision that made hesitation dangerous and confidence naive. Dust rose from the limestone floors in slow, curling clouds that did not settle, carrying the acrid scent of incense burned long ago, mingled with the metallic tang of decay and mineral. The air pressed against their lungs, heavy with the accumulated breaths of centuries, thick enough to taste as iron and old stone, yet subtle enough that it could be mistaken for air itself. Shadows lengthened in impossible directions, stretching along walls and ceilings, detaching from the living and obeying a geometry older than any memory, bending to angles that made the eye ache. The torchlight revealed surfaces polished by contact, worn smooth where bodies had pressed for decades, centuries, millennia, forming grooves and channels that guided movement without conscious thought. Every step brought resistance, subtle and deliberate, as though the labyrinth itself corrected posture, redistributed weight, enforced attention with the authority of something patient and eternal. The explorers felt the walls shift under their hands, micro-movements too faint to be noticed at first, yet impossible to ignore as their fingers traced surfaces that bent subtly to the pressure of their touch. Air currents followed paths not dictated by ventilation, but by some hidden architecture of intent, tugging at hair and clothing, brushing the skin with deliberate insistence, marking every inch of exposed flesh with the faint, persistent scent of mineral and iron. Small pebbles rolled without cause, tracing loops along the floor, pausing at certain intersections before returning to the edges of perception, as if the stone were testing attentiveness and recording the results. The labyrinth whispered in ways that could not be heard, vibrations traveling through bone and muscle rather than air, a rhythm faint but precise, older than any recorded sound, synchronized to the pulse of those who moved within. Every corner turned revealed a new impossibility, hallways folding inward, ceilings descending to meet knees while floors curved upward to intercept shoulders, angles so deliberate that the body began to learn the constraints of motion before the mind could register them. In some passages, skeletal impressions were pressed into the walls, partial and whole, arms fused into stone, torsos flattened in postures of obedience, fingers curled around edges as if testing compliance, ribs compressed against the surface as though the living had once been catalogued and molded by the architecture itself. Dust fell in faint showers from above, whispering against skin, eyes, and tongues, carrying not only particles of stone but the memory of breaths drawn and held, of pressure applied and absorbed, a slow, deliberate layering of human presence over centuries of observation. Torch flames flickered and bent unnaturally, elongating shadows into shapes that seemed to move independently, weaving through hallways and wrapping around pillars, creating a dissonant rhythm of light and dark that forced the explorers to slow, to measure every movement against the pulse of the stone. The walls vibrated faintly, a resonance almost imperceptible at first, felt rather than heard, a subtle hum that traveled from hands to shoulders, from spine to chest, a language of force older than speech, insistent and corrective. The farther they moved, the more the labyrinth seemed alive, not in the sense of movement, but in its capacity to observe, to catalog, to store every motion and posture, to register hesitation and confidence alike as data pressed into the surfaces of limestone and mineral. Dust and debris did not settle in this place. Instead, they formed slow eddies that circled the feet and rose again, carrying scent and memory upward, an invisible thread linking the living to the dead, the present to the past, a bridge constructed by stone itself. Floors shifted beneath weight, barely perceptible changes that forced balance, coaxed attention, demanded recalibration, as if the labyrinth were instructing muscles and bones in the subtle geometry of survival. In narrow corridors, walls drew closer imperceptibly, compressing shoulders and rib cages, forcing posture into alignment with lines traced long ago by hands and feet now long decayed. Every inhalation returned altered, metallic, carrying a faint echo of lives once pressed against the stone, breaths that had been filtered through layers of dust, sand, and mineral, returning as a quiet, insistent record of obedience. In the deepest reaches, torchlight revealed new impressions. Hands splayed, skulls tilted, limbs bent in impossible configurations, the dead fused into walls like living blueprints, skeletons arranged to support the stone itself, a lattice of flesh and memory, forming architecture beyond human understanding. Shadows lengthened and detached from the living, moving with intent along walls and ceilings, anticipating the torch, following the body, marking hesitation, rewarding precision, punishing misalignment with micro-shifts in pressure beneath feet and hands. Air thickened near these impressions, compressing the lungs, slowing the heart, pressing consciousness to focus solely on motion, posture, and rhythm, as if the labyrinth demanded apprenticeship in obedience before permission to survive could be granted. In certain chambers, lines were etched faintly along the walls, some resembling hieroglyphs, others mere scratches, yet all formed a continuous network of attention, recording every pass, every glance, every adjustment in balance or stance, a cataloging of presence so thorough that no movement remained unobserved. Floors tilted subtly to force distribution of weight, walls curved to guide shoulders and elbows, ceilings descended imperceptibly to teach compression, every motion corrected without sound, instruction delivered entirely through geometry, pressure, and the air itself. Dust settled in loops around feet, rising again when the body shifted, moving along invisible channels, carrying scent and tactile memory, marking the living with the imprint of the dead, embedding lessons in muscle and sinew. The labyrinth was patient. It waited while attention faltered, while breath wavered, storing error and success alike, pressing both into walls, floors, and ceilings, accumulating a record that stretched across centuries. The explorers moved forward, guided as much by instinct as intent, bodies adapting to the rhythm of the stone, lungs calibrating to the pressure of air, muscles learning the silent geometry of corridors, steps rehearsed by countless predecessors whose bones had been fused into the architecture, each movement a negotiation with something patient, ancient, and aware. Shadows bent, dust swirled, the hum of stone and air vibrated through chest and spine, and every inhalation carried centuries of obedience, measured, recorded, and stored, leaving no room for error, no space for haste. The labyrinth did not command with speech, nor with violence. It taught with presence, with attention, with patient insistence that motion itself was a language, every breath a lesson, every step a submission, every hesitation a note pressed into the ledger of eternity, and the explorers, alive but already catalogued, moved deeper into its infinite, impossible heart. The chamber opened like a wound carved into the heart of the Black Pyramid, its scale impossible to reconcile with the cramped corridors that had led them here. The floor was polished smooth, as if the passage of centuries and countless presences had worn away all resistance, leaving a surface that reflected torchlight with a faint, oily sheen. Dust swirled in the air, suspended indefinitely in currents that did not follow the logic of ventilation, carrying the faint scent of resin and iron. The subtle tang of incense burned 1,000 years ago, now distilled into something more insistent, more alive. Each inhalation felt thick, heavy with the weight of air that had been compressed by centuries of containment. Each exhalation returned metallic, carrying the ghostly echo of breaths once drawn within these walls. Shadows moved along the limestone as if they had a will of their own, curling around corners, stretching across the ceiling, retreating and advancing with intent, separate from the explorers who cast them. The walls themselves were no longer mere stone. They had become a recording of presence, a lattice of human form pressed into mineral, of bone fused with calcite and sandstone, ribs flattened against the surface, skulls angled in eternal observation, fingers hooked over edges as if grasping for attention or compliance. Gold threads, twisted and blackened with age, ran between bones, binding them together and anchoring them to the walls, forming networks that carried structural weight, supporting the ceiling with the silent insistence of the dead. The air seemed to pulse with a rhythm older than memory, vibrating faintly through bone and muscle, guiding balance, posture, and breathing without awareness, teaching the body the geometry of obedience long before thought could register it. Small fragments of limestone fell without sound, settling in slow arcs that drew attention to particular arrangements of skeletal forms, as if the chamber itself indicated points of focus, highlighted passages of instruction for the living who dared enter. Every step was measured, recalculated by the floor beneath feet and the walls beside shoulders, subtle tilts and shifts that forced the explorers into postures that mirrored those pressed into the stone. Fingers brushed against bone fused to mineral, and a faint vibration traveled from hand to shoulder, up spine to chest, a tactile lesson in the pressure and permanence encoded here. The deeper into the chamber they moved, the more the sense of observation intensified. Torches flickered against walls that were simultaneously smooth and textured, reflecting light in pools that seemed alive, bending perception, guiding gaze along lines traced long before memory had recorded its first moments. Air pockets hidden in recesses whispered faintly, releasing puffs of cold and scent that carried mineral, resin, and the faintest trace of blood, the olfactory residue of ritual, obedience, and compression. In some corners, skeletal forms were stacked, layered as if arranged deliberately to distribute structural load, creating natural buttresses that held ceilings aloft with the silent labor of the dead. The lattice of bones, gold, and stone was more than structural, it was didactic. Postures, angles, and connections taught the living how to move, where to place weight, how to balance in corridors that might fold or bend without warning. Each inhalation returned altered, metallic, carrying the resonance of lives drawn and pressed into surfaces, the echo of obedience measured and stored, a rhythm that infiltrated nerves and muscles, guiding the explorers without voice or gesture. Shadows detached from bodies, forming secondary shapes that mirrored skeletal arrangements, tracing angles along walls and ceilings, reflecting not movement but intention, rehearsing compliance in advance, rehearsing understanding before consciousness had formed it. Dust did not settle, instead moving in arcs and eddies, highlighting areas of interest, brushing across skin and eyes, leaving a faint coating that tasted of iron and stone, a tactile signature of the chamber's attention. Floors tilted subtly beneath each footfall, walls narrowed or expanded in micro-measurements, and ceilings descended imperceptibly, enforcing posture, balance, and alignment, demanding calibration through the body as much as through the mind. In certain recesses, threads of gold were embedded so deeply into bone and stone that separation seemed impossible, forming conduits that linked skeletal forms in networks, connecting weight and movement across the chamber, creating a lattice that redistributed forces in ways that defied natural architecture. The explorers felt themselves becoming part of this system, bodies adapting instinctively, muscles conforming to the pressure, lungs calibrating to the density of air, joints adjusting to the imperceptible curves of walls and floors, balance finding the paths laid out long before by forms long dead. The chamber taught without speech or gesture, using mass, weight, and presence as its curriculum, every micro shift, every vibration, every arc of dust delivering lessons encoded into limestone and bone. Small fragments of debris fell intermittently from ceiling and walls, each displacement deliberate, guiding attention, emphasizing postures, marking rhythm, creating a subtle language that only the body could understand. Torchlight revealed new impressions at every step. Skulls angled toward thresholds, rib cages flattened in patterns repeated across walls, fingers curled in ways that suggested communication, limbs interlaced with mineral and gold thread as if negotiating presence, obedience, and structure simultaneously. The lattice was alive in its silence. It observed, cataloged, recorded. Every hesitation, every micro-correction, every tilt of the head or shift of the spine was integrated, stored in the architecture as indelibly as bone and limestone. Air pulsed with slow, deliberate rhythm, vibrating through chest and limbs, reinforcing posture, balance, and attention. Dust rose along these vibrations, carrying scent, pressure, and memory upward, entwining living and dead, present and past, action and record. The chamber was patient, infinitely patient, observing the living as it had observed the dead, collecting data, compressing it into structure, teaching obedience, endurance, and recognition of weight and form. The explorers moved slowly, bodies adapting without conscious thought, their presence cataloged and integrated into the lattice, limbs adjusting instinctively, lungs calibrating, balance finding unseen paths traced by centuries of preparation. The deeper they entered, the more the lattice dominated perception, bone, gold, stone, and dust forming a singular architecture of observation and instruction, a repository of human form, compliance, and pressure. The torchlight flickered against the walls, revealing new patterns, new forms, new lessons, and every inhalation carried the insistence of eternity, metallic and iron-laced, embedding knowledge of posture, motion, and presence into every fiber of muscle, every tendon, every joint. The chamber was a teacher, a recorder, a silent architect, and the living had become students, cataloged and calibrated before they even understood the nature of their lesson. Each movement was measured against a history of the dead, each breath aligned with the rhythm of the stone, each heartbeat integrated into the lattice of observation, a testament to the eternal authority of the Black Pyramid and the patience with which it exacted its instruction, a place where life learned from death, and death had already mastered life. The sudden collapse of the limestone floor tore open a hidden gallery, revealing a passageway that had been sealed for centuries, its walls etched with hieroglyphs so dense and intricate that the torchlight seemed to tremble under their weight. The inscriptions undulated subtly, as if breathing, each curve and angle inscribed not merely in stone, but in some unseen rhythm that the air itself seemed to follow. Every glyph carried weight, a record of the bodies that had traversed these corridors, the postures adopted, the tilts of heads, the subtle rotations of shoulders, the cadence of steps, the rhythm of inhalations and exhalations long since returned to dust. The explorers stepped into this gallery with the trepidation of those who understand that knowledge in this place was not passive. It demanded attention, recorded presence, and punished the inattentive with imperceptible correction. Dust rose from the floor in suspended clouds that resisted gravity, carrying scents of resin, iron, and mineral, thick and insistent, layering itself with the memory of countless breaths drawn, held, and compressed over centuries. Each inhalation returned metallic and thick, embedding itself in lungs and sinews, a tactile reminder that the pyramid observed, measured, cataloged, and responded. Shadows slithered along the walls, separating from the explorers, merging with hieroglyphs, stretching and contracting as if animated by the same intelligence that had crafted the lattice of bone and gold in the heart of the pyramid. The explorers felt themselves being mapped, every movement registered in the invisible ledger of stone and air, and instinctively they adjusted, aligning posture and gait with patterns they could not see but somehow felt, muscles contracting and releasing under pressure not wholly their own. The gallery's floor tilted subtly beneath their feet, walls narrowed and expanded in micro-measurements, ceilings descended imperceptibly, and every adjustment was enforced with a silent authority that required no voice, no hands, no flesh to impose its will. The hieroglyphs seemed to pulse faintly, vibrating through sight and touch, each symbol a node in a network that linked the gallery with every corridor, chamber, and hidden recess of the labyrinth. Dust followed these vibrations, swirling in loops and eddies, brushing against skin and clothing, carrying mineral, resin, and the metallic tang of memory, embedding itself in hair and pores, leaving traces that would persist long after the explorers departed. Bones pressed into the walls, remnants of priests and scribes long dead, protruded in deliberate arrangements, fingers hooked over edges, ribs compressed into stone, skulls angled toward thresholds, limbs entwined with gold and thread, forming a lattice that supported the walls, ceiling, and the intangible authority that pervaded every inch of space. The gallery was not merely a corridor, but a machine of observation, its mechanisms subtle and invisible, functioning entirely through weight, posture, motion, and breath. Every hesitation, every tilt of the head, every misalignment of the spine was recorded, compressed into the stone, and transmitted through air currents, dust, and vibration. Small fragments of limestone fell intermittently, not randomly, guiding attention, marking points of focus, reinforcing postures, teaching the living how to navigate a geometry designed to enforce obedience. Torchlight flickered against walls etched with glyphs and bone, revealing new patterns with each pulse of flame, shapes that seemed to anticipate movement, lines that shifted imperceptibly, angles that bent subtly to weight and motion. Air currents tugged at hair and clothing, brushing skin, pressing into lungs, reminding muscles, joints, and sinews of the rhythm the labyrinth demanded, calibrating balance and breath with a precision that defied human comprehension. The explorers sensed the presence of intelligence, but it was not conscious in the way flesh and mind are conscious. It was a persistence, a memory made solid, a pattern enforced with patience and inevitability, a geometry that corrected itself without awareness. Hieroglyphs along the walls recorded not narrative but action. The arc of a shoulder, the extension of a finger, the micro-rotation of a pelvis, the subtle timing of steps. Every motion left its imprint, every hesitation a trace, every adjustment noted and stored. In deeper recesses, fragments of gold threaded through bone and limestone formed conduits connecting skeletal forms across the gallery, transmitting force and attention, reinforcing the structure, distributing weight, and preserving a record of movement as thoroughly as the walls themselves. Shadows detached from the living, merging with inscriptions in bone, forming a secondary network of observation, guiding gaze and attention, punishing neglect with imperceptible shifts in pressure beneath feet and hands. The gallery had a rhythm, slow, deliberate, inflexible yet fluid, vibrating through chest, spine, and limbs, a language that required embodiment, presence, and compliance to comprehend. Dust moved along this rhythm, eddying in invisible channels, carrying mineral, metallic residue, and memory, weaving the living into the history of those who had come before. Every inhalation, every exhalation, every heartbeat, every micro-adjustment of muscle or tendon was measured, recorded, and responded to by the chamber, transmitted outward along lines of hieroglyph, bone, gold, and limestone, integrating the explorers into the pyramid's infinite ledger. Movement became a negotiation, each step a submission, each breath a lesson, each hesitation a note pressed into the memory of the stone. The gallery corrected, adjusted, and enforced its own geometry with an intelligence that required no flesh, no mind, only presence and time. The explorers realized with horror that the pyramid was not a tomb, nor merely a labyrinth. It was a living archive of obedience and endurance, an apparatus of memory and calibration, a monument that had learned, adapted, and perfected the measurement of those who entered. Every motion was anticipated, every posture catalogued, and every breath transformed into data pressed into the walls, ceilings, and floors. The pyramid did not imprison in the conventional sense. It trained, it observed, it corrected, and it enforced its own logic with inexorable precision. Shadows slithered, dust spiraled, and the air pulsed with metallic rhythm, embedding lessons in sinew and bone, and the explorers, alive yet already catalogued, moved forward with the uneasy knowledge that they were no longer alone, that they were recorded, measured, and integrated into a system older and more patient than any human reckoning, a system that required no mind to enforce its will, only presence, only compliance, only life pressed into its memory. The chamber at the heart of the labyrinth opened into the desert night with the subtle inevitability of a trap long set, its exit framed by limestone that shimmered faintly beneath the pale moon. Torchlight flickered against walls that seemed to exhale, releasing a heavy, metallic sweet air that clung to lungs and sinew, pressing insistently on chest and diaphragm, as if the pyramid itself had chosen to follow. Shadows moved with a latency that was impossible to reconcile with reality, stretching, skewing, and lagging behind the explorers, refusing to match the angles of their bodies, reflecting a rhythm older and more deliberate than any heartbeat. The desert outside appeared unbroken, calm, infinite, yet each grain of sand seemed to vibrate faintly underfoot, carrying the echo of pressure, posture, and weight encoded within the pyramid's hidden architecture. The air smelled of resin and iron, a distilled memory of centuries compressed into molecules that pressed upon the senses with an authority no human could resist. Each inhalation returned altered, metallic, laced with the scent of bone fused to stone, of gold-threaded ligaments preserved against time, of countless breaths held in the silent discipline of chambers whose ceilings threatened collapse, yet never yielded. The explorers noticed first the subtleties, compasses quivering, maps refusing alignment, horizons that bent slightly at the periphery of vision, lines and angles that were familiar yet deliberately displaced, as if the world itself had been measured, adjusted, and catalogued by some unseen hand. Muscles, tendons, and sinews remembered the corridors and chambers with an intimacy that defied reason, guiding posture and gait without conscious effort, recalling angles and weights they had never encountered in the open desert. Shadows fell wrong, then righted themselves only partially, their edges curling along invisible lines, extending fingers toward hidden thresholds, sketching forms that mirrored the lattice of bone and gold threaded through stone deep within the pyramid. Dust, carried on currents that existed outside wind, settled on skin, hair, and clothing, embedding faint traces of mineral, resin, and memory, a residue of the labyrinth's meticulous recording of presence. The explorers moved with a careful deliberation learned within the corridors, their bodies instinctively adjusting to pressures and angles that no eye had ever witnessed, steps taken with the unconscious precision demanded by centuries of encoded instruction. One figure paused at the edge of the chamber, torchlight trembling in hand, and noticed that the sand beneath booted feet compressed differently in patterns that traced the pathways of the pyramid's interior, as if memory had seeped outward through limestone, stone, and dust to manifest across desert terrain. Breath came slowly, measured, each exhalation vibrating with the latent pulse of corridors and chambers, a rhythm that had been absorbed into bone and sinew, becoming a permanent, inescapable tutor. The horizon remained calm, yet the sense of being catalogued persisted, invisible hands tracing weight, angle, and alignment along every line of the body, every fraction of movement that had once been contained within walls now extending outward, a presence without form, demanding attention, obedience, and recognition. The explorers discovered small anomalies that should have been imperceptible, a grain of sand displaced in a line that mirrored a threshold, the subtle lean of a dune reflecting an archway, the placement of shadows at noon suggesting angles previously memorized in the labyrinth's chambers. Each adjustment felt deliberate, precise, and inescapable, an imprint of architecture encoded into the world outside, ensuring that the lessons of the Black Pyramid could not be left behind. Muscles contracted, relaxed, recalibrated automatically, guided by memory that was no longer solely human, embedding itself in the body as surely as bone had been embedded in stone, gold-threaded, calcified, preserved by centuries of patient instruction. The desert wind carried whispers that were not wind, echoes of metallic breathing, pressure, and subtle vibrations, resonating through sinew, tendon, and bone, reinforcing postures learned beneath ceilings that had threatened collapse, yet had held with infinite patience. Maps drawn before entry were misaligned. Compass needles wavered and spun at thresholds of influence, refusing the geometry of the world, reflecting instead the interior logic of the labyrinth, extending outward into the open air, embedding instruction where none should exist. Even in sleep, the explorers felt angles, weights, and pressures, body memory persisting as if the pyramid had grown into them, a tutor that did not rest, whose lesson followed through hours, days, and nights, extending beyond sight and consciousness into every micro-adjustment of posture and balance. Shadows in their rooms moved subtly against familiar contours, furniture, and walls, trailing the traces of steps taken long ago, the lattice of bone and gold, limestone and dust, still active, still enforcing rhythm, presence, and correction. The air tasted faintly of mineral and iron, of incense burned countless centuries ago, pressing into lungs with insistence, marking each inhalation with instruction that no conscious thought could resist. Even thought itself was measured, angles of consideration bending subtly in response to rhythms absorbed beneath stone ceilings, along corridors that had catalogued every movement, every hesitation, every micro-shift of the living explorers. The pyramid had not merely imprisoned the dead, nor merely catalogued the living. It had taught, observed, recorded, and now extended its lesson into the world beyond, into the desert, into sinew, bone, and memory. Every movement, every breath, every thought was a continuation of a geometry older than the explorers themselves, one that demanded compliance without notice, imprinting itself invisibly into the very fabric of experience. And when the rest of the team emerged, the desert seemed imperceptibly altered, dunes subtly realigned, horizons slightly skewed, compasses quivering, maps refusing convention, the world now a lattice extending outward from the Black Pyramid's hidden heart. Bodies remembered angles, pressures, chains, and postures they had never seen. Each muscle and tendon a living archive of lessons encoded in limestone, gold, and bone. The Black Pyramid had not been merely a tomb, it had been a teacher. Its lesson had followed them into open air, inscribed into sinew, tendon, and bone, impossible to forget, impossible to escape, a geometry of obedience and memory that stretched beyond walls, beyond shadow, beyond sand, reaching into every living moment that had passed and every one yet to come.